All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD1000 Web Development Technologies course, I'm creating a series of video presentations based on the PowerPoint slides for the book, one of the two books we're using for the class, and that being Murox's JavaScript and jQuery 4th edition. There's the book. It's a little bigger picture of it. And here are the chapters. So there's the JavaScript Essentials, which is the first 7 chapters. jQuery Essentials, I probably will go over those, but slowly because we're not going to cover that in the class. Advanced JavaScript Skills, take it to the next level. So let's just jump right into Chapter 1. All right, you can see what's in here, how the web works, how the ECMA specs works, the components of a JavaScript app, the HTML skills you will need for the book, the CSS skills you will need for the book, how to test a JavaScript application, and how to use visual code to develop JavaScript. So I'm just going to, like I said, jump right in here. Whoops. And there it is. Okay. All right, so here we go. Chapter 1, Introduction to Web Development. Now, when they set up their objectives, they have, like you can see here, applied and knowledge objectives. I don't want to sit and read to you. All right, I will leave those up there for just a second. We'll learn about JavaScript in this chapter. We'll learn about the web in this chapter. We'll learn about Visual Studio Code in this chapter. This is one of the places where this book has changed from the previous book that we had, which was the 3rd edition. The 3rd edition, rather than going through VS Code, they went through, I believe it was Atom or one different editor. So here's the other knowledge objectives in here. But again, not my intention to sit and read every one of these out to you. All right, the components of a web app, and this has changed over the years. All right, a few years ago when they had this picture here, they had a computer here, and a computer here. But now, considering the fact that more than half the people who end up using the internet for whatever reason are doing it on a non-laptop, non-desktop device, all right, you can see that we've added the tablet, we've added the smartphone component. All right, so let's take a look at some of these terms. They may end up defining them in here as well, but I'm just going to quickly give you my own definition. Client. That's the person basically who's entering something into the address bar, the person who wants to access the internet. Web browser. That's the tool that you use to access the internet. Web server. If I go in and I just put in rankin.edu and I hit enter, that's me entering, I'm the client. That's me entering rankin.edu using my web browser. That goes off to a server someplace in St. Louis that Rankin owns. I'm sending out what's called an HTTP or a hypertext transfer protocol request, and I'm getting back some HTML in the form of an HTTP or a hypertext transfer protocol response. This all happens over a network. All right. Now, the network that we're talking about here is not an intranet. With an intranet, it's usually like within the same company. So for instance, if we were going to have a class at Rankin, all right, and it was going to be just with Rankin people. When I say a class, I mean for instructors, let's say, we might use an intranet. All right. The other way I look at an intranet is, you know, imagine Walmart, because they've got different setups with a lot of different companies that they get to send them products. They have intranet setups with them. Now, when the connections between computers are in the same room or the same building where they literally can be hardwired, that's a local area network, an LAN. All right, the computers that we have in the IT labs at Rankin-Wentzville are part of a LAN. On the other hand, there is no direct connection between the computers at Rankin Technical College, Wentzville, and those about 40 to 45 miles away in St. Louis. There's no underground connection or no connection of another kind. There's no direct connection. Instead, it's a wide area network, and that's how the connection is done. So when it's not on site, it's a wide area network, okay? So the internet is basically just this huge network that's made up of networks. And your ISP or your internet service provider is who provides you, with what you're able to do over the internet. So here's a static web page. I've already mentioned the HTTP request and response, but with a static web page, it's pretty simple. All right. The only way that you can change the content on a static web page is to literally bring the site down, make your changes, and bring the site back up again. There's no interactivity, so to speak, in a static web page. All right. Now it says here, here's a dynamic web page. And when you think about it, if I go out to Amazon right now, if I were to grab this book and wanted this book and said I wanted to put it in my shopping cart, it would appear then up there. There is an interactivity taking place. Why? Because that's going to involve the use of more than one server. So notice it goes for the HTTP request goes from my browser to a web server, but the web server has got to send it out, and it may go to several servers in the interim before it comes back to the first web server and back as an HTTP response with HTML. All right, that's the round trip that they're talking about there. A web page with image swaps and rollovers, you probably have all seen these when you take your mouse and you put it on a page and it changes. For instance, here, notice this kid's short-sleeved. It looks like it's in 3 colors, and one color is showing now. If I would put my mouse over here, it would change to that color, etc. So how does JavaScript fit into this? Again, JavaScript is basically what allows the interaction to take place, the interactivity. All right. And JavaScript today is used both on the client side and the server side. Not too many years ago, it was almost exclusively a client-side tool, but today it's on the client side and the server side. JavaScript is a scripting language. That said, it's a full-fledged programming language. The JavaScript engine is basically built into every computer that's been that's been made for the last 10, 15 or more years. Now, jQuery is it's a JavaScript library that used to be used to make your life easier when using JavaScript. And when I say used to be, it still is used. It's still used in millions of sites. But regular JavaScript, also known as vanilla JavaScript or vanilla JS, has gotten so popular that the popularity of jQuery has waned over the years. It's not as popular as it used to be. All right. When you can do processing on the actual user's machine itself, that's client side. The more power you give the client, the fatter the client and the thinner the server. The less power you give the client, the thinner the client and the thicker the server. All right, some of the ways that you can use JavaScript and jQuery. Data validation. All right, so if you've got a form, you might want to validate that form using JavaScript to make sure what you put in there is valid. Image swaps and rollovers I've already talked about. Slideshows we'll take a look at a little bit later. So JavaScript is under the purview, so to speak, of what's called ECMA, or the European Computer Manufacturers Association. All right, and you'll notice it's about now 24 years old. All right, and they used to have different versions, but now, as it says here, it's typically, you hear a lot like maybe ECMA v6 or ECMA v7 or v8, but we're going to try to work with as much as possible the latest and the greatest. Some of the things that have been added recently, well, what we're going to end up putting at the top of virtually all of our programs is use strict. And what that does with the use strict basically is it allows you, it makes JavaScript more responsible, for lack of better words. And what I mean by that is JavaScript is a fairly easy to learn language for two reasons. All right. And it's because it's got a fairly simple syntax and it's very forgiving. But the fact that it's very forgiving also makes it kind of hard to use. So when you run your programs in strict mode, you're, for lack of better words, you're telling JavaScript to be less forgiving. All right. In ES5, there were new methods that were added to work with arrays and objects, and we're going to really talk about those like crazy. As JavaScript has gone on, the importance of XML, or the extensible markup language, is kind of dwindled, and the way that you work with JSON or JavaScript object notation has become more and more important. All right. In ES6, again, syntactic improvements, block scope. We're going to talk about let and var and const in a little bit. We'll also get into arrow functions, iterators, promises, the whole idea of async await for running asynchronous code. ES 2016, again, simpler syntax. 17, that was the async with the await. 18, more asynchronous iteration, more regular expression features. We'll hit on all this stuff. Some of it, as you probably guess, more so than others. But we'll talk about everything that's in here. ES 2019, new string, array, and object methods, improvements to the JSON object. 2020, the new big int data type, and new ways of working with null. Browsers that support ECMAScript, hey, all of them. Now, of course, some of them are going to be older browsers, and the support they give will be more limited. All right, but the newer the version of the browser you're using, the better off you'll be. As it says, at the time of this writing, the features of ECMAScript through ES 2019 are supported by all the modern browsers that are listed here. All right, let's talk for just a second here. We're at 12 minutes, so we're doing just fine. I'm going to try to keep these talks down to about 20 minutes or so, okay? All right. So here is, come on, there you go. There's an HTML program that has no CSS applied to it. Remember, I look at HTML, the hypertext markup language, CSS, cascading style sheets, and JavaScript is kind of like being a three-legged stool. To make a truly interactive, well-working, good-looking website, you really need all three of these. HTML, the hypertext markup language, allows you to put content on a web page. CSS, cascading style sheets, allows you to style the content on a web page. And JavaScript, also known as JS in some circles, allows interactivity on a web page. So you see what it looks like now as opposed to there. There's the same page after CSS has been applied to it. All right, so no CSS, CSS. Now, when you bring CSS, you should always have your CSS in an external style sheet that you link to in the head section. Always do it that way. JavaScript can go in different places. They talk about putting it down here. I'm not even going to suggest that. I'm going to suggest that we put it up in here, but when we put it in, we use what's called the defer tag as well. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. We're going to go over it. So again, here's that same web page they showed earlier with CSS rather applied to it. Now, you'll notice here we've got 3 asterisks, which typically means these are all required fields. So if you leave one or more of them blank and you click join list, these will change from asterisks to messages. And the way that happens is through JavaScript code. All right, so they show you this is the CSS file, and that's what's going to be in the file. All right, and you'll notice we can have several different kinds of error messages. Now, if we left grace@yahoo.com empty here, it would have said email address is required. If in here we would have left it blank, it would have said like confirm email address is required. You'll notice we put grace@yahoo.com here and just grace@yahoo. So we get a different message. Emails must match. Here, since we left the first name blank, all right, we get first name is required. All the code to do that is going to be in the email.js file. Now, this is the first chapter of the book. So I don't want to spend a lot of time going over this. All right. Here we're using a $sign for what I like to call an alias. All right. Just going to make it so we have to type in a little less code. All right. And what are we doing here? Well, email 1 is going to be whatever we put into here. Email 2 is going to be whatever we put into here. And first name is going to be whatever we put into here. That's what it's telling it right here. If the first email was left blank, we say email is required. Otherwise, there's something in there. We're not checking it to make sure it's a valid email. We're just checking to make sure there's something in there. So if there's something in there, setting this thing equal to double quote, we'll say we want there to be no message there. Then we do a similar type of thing with email 2. But you'll notice rather than checking to see if it's blank, we check to see if it matches email 1. Then we check the first name. And again, we're checking to see if it's blank. If we get down to the bottom here, now at the beginning, we set is valid to true. But if we left the email out, it's now false. Or if the emails don't match, it's now false. Or if the first name is left off, it's now false. If any of those happen, this is a shortcut for saying if is valid equal false, we do a prevent default, which means don't do anything. All right. And this right here is going to put those asterisks back again. This is going to clear the values out of the 3 text boxes. This puts the focus or the cursor in the first email. And this right here says once it's loaded, if you click the button that says join list, this says then you should call the join list method. This says if you click the button called clear form, you should call the clear form method. That's it. Now, one of the things that was introduced in HTML5 were these things that are known as semantic elements. So with semantic elements, you now have things like header, main, section, etc. Semantic means that basically the system can look at them and figure out what you're doing based on the context in which they're being used. So you'll notice we've got a header section, we've got a main section, we've got a footer section. This is how we're going to write our code. The CDN for JavaScript shiv for HTML5 capability. What this shiv is saying, I'm just going to keep it simple. What this shiv is saying here is, hey, if you're using an older browser and you come up with, for example, one of the new HTML5 components and you don't understand it, forget about that it's an HTML5 component. Treat it like it's an older type of component, for lack of better words. You should now understand the difference between divs and spans. A div is a block level element, meaning it takes up whatever the width of the browser is that you set up by default, and it's a container. It can hold other divs, it can hold spans. A span is an inline element, which means it doesn't take up the whole thing. It only takes up part. And divs are typically inside of spans. Here's some examples. Now, there's nothing in there yet but comments. And when you start something with a slash like that, it means it's a comment. All right. So here in the divs, we've added the spans. This is adding the 3 asterisks that are either going to have one of 3 or 4 values. Either an asterisk, nothing, or an error message. Asterisk, nothing, or an error message. asterisk, nothing, or an error message. All right. The basic HTML attributes that you need to understand. What's the difference between an ID and a class? Typically, there should only be one ID of a certain name on each page. You can have as many IDs as you want, but they should each have different names to them. Classes are meant to be shared between different elements. All right, the name attribute, we're not going to use that much at the beginning, but we will at the end. And we use it much more in the AWD1000 database-driven websites class. And the name attribute is used for server-side processing. The for attribute that's in there, that is used to help link or sync up labels with text boxes. All right. And the title is typically used for accessibility purposes. We're going to hit on all this stuff. So here's an example. Notice class equal first H2. There's an ID. There's the for, and there's a title. All right. You're going to end up with something like this. Okay. I should be right around 20 minutes now, a little bit over. So I'm going to stop right here, pick it up with the next one.